Hi, and welcome to Ethnographic Imagination Basel, a series on reimagining the world from the mundane. My name is George Paul Mayu, and in this episode we will talk about data, the collection and processing of information often using technology such as artificial intelligence or AI. Our guest is Alec Bălăşescu, whose scholarly work explores the rising importance of AI in transforming understandings of humanity, nature, and the machine. So stay with us for a conversation on how data in AI may help us reimagine not only the world, as I usually like to say, but also what it means to imagine in the first place. Alec Bălăşescu is Associate Faculty at the Royal Roads University in British Columbia, Canada. A social and cultural anthropologist, his research and teaching have covered a broad set of themes from bodily aesthetics, fashion and politics to human-technology interactions, climate change and health. He is author of the book Paris Chic, Tehran Thrills, Aesthetic Bodies, Political Subjects, published in 2007, a book that traces circulations of fashion between France and Iran as a way to reflect on intersections of consumption, modernity, and religion. Alec's more recent work revolves around human-technology interactions, topics he picked up among other places with a quite distinct spark of imagination, I may say, in two recent articles in the Journal of Future Robot Life. One is entitled Machine Anthropology, or Will Robots Talk About Us Behind Our Backs? The other, co-authored with Cristina is entitled Augmented Anthropology, Interstitial Anthropology in the Limits of Humanity. He is also author of a forthcoming book that will be published soon by Springer Nature with a tentative title Artificial, Naturally, Climate Change in the Age of AI. Our conversation will focus today on data, especially through the prism of machine learning, algorithms, and the implications that these have for the ethnographic imagination. Alec, we are very happy to have you in the studio, and thank you for being in Basel.
George, thank you so much for inviting me here, and I'm honored and eager to hear your questions.
I must confess that I'm one of those people who feel like constant beginners when it comes to the topic of AI, which I often find both overwhelming and perhaps sometimes also intimidating. But being here in conversation with you, I can easily overcome both those things. So can we start maybe with some basics? What is AI? What does it do with data? And most importantly for us, perhaps, what might we as anthropologists have to offer to this debate that is meaningful?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I would like to comment on what you said in the beginning, that you feel a constant beginner. Well, I think that's anthropological method in a nutshell, right? We approach any phenomena as beginners, as novices, and probably we end up with more questions than answers. And at least this is how I understand anthropology, and this is how I approach the question of artificial intelligence. For the moment, for me, artificial intelligence is a big misnomer. There's nothing artificial about it, yeah. And there's probably debatable what intelligence is, because it's in fact one of those social categories, facts, that pushes us to rethink what intelligence means. And as for the second question, data, what artificial intelligence does with data, I think, and I'm trying to reformulate in order to bring us one step back, is what is data for artificial intelligence, and how these assemblages that are human technological assemblages create the data that they need in order to offer us an image of a world that has some certain qualities that we can discuss further.
But just to dwell a bit on what you have just said, there is nothing artificial about artificial intelligence. What do you mean? A common listener who, like me, is not that fluent in the language of AI can easily think, well, there is an organic intelligence in us as human beings, right? Mm-hmm. That is different from, and that difference itself can be very productive or generative, culturally, socially.
Mm-hmm. When I say that, I'm thinking about those systems, because they are systems working. They do not work in themselves. They first of all are a product of making, in Tim Ingold's terms. Maybe it's a cultural making. We make them and we make them work somehow, and they work in relation with human systems, be them culture, institutions, society, and so on. The distinction between what is nature and something that is outside of nature, as you are well aware, it's a cultural distinction. Yeah. So in this way, I'm trying to rework or efface this type of distinction, which brings us against, of course, the distinction subject-object and nature, culture. Of course, the distinctions that are problematic if you are to posit an objective perspective of the world. Yeah. So this is where that's why I'm saying it's nothing artificial about it, because artificial in itself is a cultural product term. Right. That has a history.
So it is about, in a way, challenging common sense understandings of these divides, culture, nature, and so on. And then, of course, I think it's also very interesting to look at how those divides continue to be posited through discourse.
Absolutely, and they do produce, as you say, they produce entire domains of research, entire disciplines, and so on, and they are valid, but not universally valid.
Absolutely.
And that's something that I'm trying to work around in my thinking, recontextualization of the way we think about sciences. Mm-hmm. And I'm using plural to make the distinction that Bruno Latour makes between science as a phantasm and as a phantasm, basically, as a universal category that is used to assert a certain type of objectivity that may exist, and sciences that are very specific corpus of knowledges that are applicable at a certain layer, at a certain level, and to a certain fragment of that which we call reality.
Right. So here we are then caught in between, on the one hand, discursive claims to universality, to a reality of a particular kind, bound, binary, you name it. On the other hand, a reality that is much messier, much more complex. And as an anthropologist, trying to navigate that in-between space. I should also say that I have had the privilege to read parts of your manuscript that deals precisely with these topics in quite illuminating ways. And one of the things that I remember most strikingly about it is your effort to, the way I see it, or I read your work, to de-exceptionalize AI. That is to say, we can say that at some level, AI claims to be bound, to be purified of context. It has an objectivity that is inherent to its logics, to its workings. It is free of bias. At the same time, it also claims or promises to optimize, to virtualize, to dematerialize, to economize, you name it, right? So it's such a loaded domain of fantasy and imagination. And on the other hand, in a more messy reality, as it were, and as you argue, things look quite differently.
Yes, they do. And it couldn't have been otherwise, because as we do, when you all these concepts, all these laboratory ideas, AI is a lab idea. The laboratory itself is a product or a category that was invented with the Galilean revolution. This is Galileo who said, okay, we can slice a part of reality, make our experiments there, and pretend that this is applicable to everything else. Yeah, as it is in lab, we can reproduce it in nature, and that's already a new layer of reality, right?
Right.
What Baudrillard would call it, it's already a hyper reality in Baudrillard terms. So artificial intelligence so the proponents of artificial intelligence, the techno-optimists, if you want, they base their claim on the idea that artificial intelligence works with mathematics, which is exact. And they transfer the exactitude of the mathematics on the accuracy of observation. But to arrive from the observation to mathematics, it's short circuit. It's a short circuit there, because in order to arrive from the observation to mathematics, you need to quantify the observation. And that's where data production takes place. And that's the most problematic part of artificial intelligence and the least talked about. Because we only talk about the fact that, if it's exact, as in mathematics, that must be accurate. But we don't talk about how did we get to that exactitude. And that's the question that haunts me.
How we get to that exactitude and what is left behind in that.
Exactly. What is cut out? And there's a lot. There's a lot cut out. And it's interesting to see that when we go back with a tool produced like this, to apply it outside of the laboratory, reality has a way to strike back.
Right, exactly.
And it causes what it was initially called reality drift. Even the language, it's interesting. Then they talked...
a distraction. Almost, right?
Yes, the reality doesn't behave as it should. Then the term was changed into model drifting. That is the model... and the model
slipping away.
Yeah, slipping away because it drifts away from the reality that it has this way of contradicting any model at some point or another. And it's interesting because also there is a popular confusion, because most of us are laymen in what does it mean artificial intelligence. It's a popular confusion between mathematics and mathematical models and algorithms. Algorithms are not mathematical models. Algorithms are a suite of logical propositions. And they are produced within a certain culture and within a certain logic.
But the mathematical logic is still central to their unfolding, to algorithms.
Yes, then they are taken and codified as mathematics. Uh-huh. But they are sets of logical propositions. If this, then this. If this, then this. But what is this and what is that is not mathematically exact.
And there we are in culture.
Yeah. I mean, and even, I mean, it's interesting to look at the history of that. Al-Khawarizmi was a polymath in the 9th century in the Renaissance Islam in the area of the Persian Empire. And he came up with this. He was known in Italy as Algoritmi. And from there, if you remember, I mean, probably you're too young for that, sorry, but there was a moment in which computers were huge machines like this room.
Occupying rooms.
And they were fed this kind of punched cards.
Cards, yeah.
And who fed those cards and who punched them were the programmers. And the programmers were somewhere very low in terms of hierarchy. Yeah. And in MIT, you have these blue coats programmers that were kind of looked down upon. And it was a cultural change in the 70s when the cast of programmers developed this language around the algorithms as being the objective way of looking at their reality that pushed them socially and culturally up on the hierarchy of work in the domain.
When in fact, they were all about the engagement with the materiality of the cards, with the tangential of the worker in front of the machine. Probably.
Exactly. Yeah.
When you talk about the mathematical and the kind of incursion of the mathematical in the algorithm and so on, suddenly what comes to mind is a lot of the work in cybernetics, including by Gregory Bateson, where he kept insisting that, well, data is the difference, that any difference that makes a difference, whatever piece of information that makes a difference, but also against a certain kind of modernist mathematical logic, that the map is never the territory. Whereas what we have here is the insistence that the mathematical equation is the reality. It is the territory, right?
It's great you brought the maps in, because a big part in the book is about maps. And I think it's Mario Vargas Llosa or Marquez. It's a story by Marquez about map makings, and it's called The Difference Between Science and Exactitude. And the story is one paragraph. And it talks about how this emperor wanted the perfect map of the capital. But he wanted it so perfect that the geographers needed to make a map as big as the city to cover it, because every data point should be exact. And then he wanted it to be as big as the empire. And of course, everything failed, and you could walk through the full empire and you still find pieces of this map laying around. So yes, that's probably the biggest misunderstanding in artificial intelligence, is that, but it's also productive misunderstanding, because it produces institutions and practices that treat this as being the reality. And that's where real problem starts. Like, biases, ethical questions, decisions that are taken and that influence real people's life.
But these are also contradictions and failures and moments of tension that, for an anthropologist, I think very interesting to start with. May I just share with our audience that a lot of the inspiration that came in your book comes from ethnography in a hospital setting.
Yes.
That you did.
Yes.
In Canada, wasn't it?
Yes.
Where you see this fail over and over again.
Yes. That's what happened. In fact, I could see how very simple the expectation of what good work would be in relationship with the machines and the caregiver, the machine, and the patient. In fact, for the people who are surveying and seeing on the screen the rate of, let's say, medication administration in conformity with the workflow, what would for them look like failure, for the caregiver would look like saving the life. Especially, for example, in the emergency, in which all the complicated workflow of medicine administration would not allow for immediate intervention on the patient. That would be in an emergency. But the person who supervises from quality insurance, they would be like, oh, they don't do it. Look at the graph. It's so low. They do very, very low scanning. And I proposed to do a mini ethnography. And I said, well, of course they do very low mini scan, because otherwise the patient would die if they would follow the workflow. Another interesting thing was that healthcare workers do find so-called workarounds. They manage a way to feed the machine with what the machine wants
to make it shut up.
Yes, and to make it look good on the graph that is seen on the other side.
Because they realize the limits of the machine.
Exactly. Yeah. So and it's a constant negotiation between that objectivity, the assumed objectivity of the machine, and the constraints of the context, including physical space, including the way spaces are built, the way cities function. I mean, we talk about nested system, and I have another example from medical practice. same thing. The same system was supposed to go in 40 different hospitals, but in order to have the medication in a closed loop and to have the instantaneity, the hour in which medication would start to be distributed to the patient had to be moved in this particular hospital from 7:30 in the morning to 7, which means that the pharmacist technologies needed to be half an hour earlier than usual. The hospital was built in a very expensive real estate area, and the pharmacists were not paid enough to live there. Mm-hmm. And the public transport did not offer anything to bring them half an hour earlier. Therefore, they resigned. And this had cascading effects on the institution that needed to hire pharmacists and ask them to do technologist work, which caused frustration, of course. But they needed to pay them, to hire pharmacists, to pay them as pharmacists, to live closer or to have cars.
Right. It's fascinating there that, in a way, the AI treats the institution as somehow existing in a vacuum, mm-hmm. as opposed to these overlapping ecologies that you described.
Right, and nested systems, and yeah.
Well, a recurring question with AI and data is that of where does the machine stop and the human subject begin, or vice versa? Is there a limit there, or are these becoming themselves blurry? And one thing that I keep thinking with is, for example, the digital pacemaker that now also collects data on heartbeat for so many patients is becoming very, very common, right? Which is something where data is produced through the body from a machine in the body, extrapolated elsewhere, making these questions of a separation, otherwise so central to the very idea of the artificial, as you call it, mm-hmm. very mm-hmm. blurry.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you go back to Merleau-Ponty and his idea of how do you feel yourself? Mm-hmm. Well, what does it mean to feel your finger? It's you who feel the finger, but the finger is also you, right? Well, these systems augment our capacity of feeling and imagining our bodies, right? Because up to a few years ago, you wouldn't count your steps. But now I pull out my phone and I have a step counter and calorie counter and
which
whatever
tells you
have
how to
you
feel about your body.
Exactly. And then it literally modifies the way you perceive yourself. Who is you? Is it the same you before the phone? I'm not so sure. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the questions that I constantly try to work and to move away from the idea of a pre-existing subject, the knowing subject, to a sort of constant and continuous subjectivation, which gives birth to emergent forms of thinking, which we're in a kind of we're in a thinking space, and that thinking aggregates time and again in a different form. And sometimes we claim the computer things, sometimes we claim the individual things, but in fact it's the individual and the computer together thinking, and us together thinking. There's no so I use this as dismantling the old modernity idea of the individual creator and the individual autonomous subject. Basically, that's the entire beauty of the artificial intelligence, let's say, is that we can think with it, against it.
Right. So to the extent to which data, say imaginaries like my steps being counted by my phone app, are essential to our idea of ourselves, they become forms of subjectivation. They are in us, not necessarily out of us, or the very in-out no longer holds.
Exactly, and it recreates us, whatever that is, us is in a different way. Obviously, as you know, it will make us walk differently, eat differently, interact differently,
desire,
and
perceive,
so on.
differently.
Yeah.
In the set of articles that I mentioned before about future robot kind of technologies, you talk about machine anthropology, which refers for you, and I'm quoting here, to a potentiality of the future when humanity itself will be the object of analysis for the informed gaze of artificial intelligence. What happens when we are confronted, in other words, with the idea that a discourse about humanity is now produced by robots, or what you call robo-ethnography. I love that term. What does this encounter with the robo-ethnography, or the possibility? It's not really just a possibility, because it's already there.
That's what I wanted to say. It's 5 years old, so
it's old. What does the possibility, the idea of that encounter then generate? It seems unsettling, but is it?
Well, there are two things. I think one is that kind of set of knowledge already exists, and as we discussed up to now, we refer to it as being the objective reality about us. Mm-hmm. Second, it does not exist as quoted there because there's no autonomy of thinking, only within the machine. The thinking is always together. And probably, and I anticipate a little bit your question, and probably that's also transferable to the knowledge produced during the early days of anthropology and afterwards with the coloniality, because it was always the idea that the colonizer produces knowledge about.
Right.
But in fact, it was knowledge produced through the interaction, and everybody changed at the same time. As it's brilliantly shown, there are two books. There's, of course, David Wengrow and David Graeber, mm-hmm. The Dawn of Everything, that talks about how, for example, ideas of modern democracy may have come as well from First Nations in what is now Canada.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And second is another book by a historian, what's her name? John Quinn, I think, who rewrites the history as not the history of nations and territories, but of history of human beings and their interactions.
Right.
Yeah.
So the fact that, of course, in colonial settings, knowledge production
was never unilateral.
It was in asymmetrical relationships, but that doesn't mean unilateral.
Yes.
And that's an important thing to remember. There is also this kind of decentering thing that comes with AI. So, robots are producing ethnography about us. How do we feel about that? But that's also something that's kind of ongoing in anthropology, where some people produce knowledge about other people, and then the encounter can be unsettling. Mm-hmm. But one wonders then also what you said about not producing knowledge about, but with mm-hmm. With technology, if that itself is novel, because we've always produced. You mentioned the cards that are fed into the machine, right? Mm-hmm. The materiality of the card, the interaction with the card that is fed into these old type computers is itself a certain kind of thinking with, as opposed to, from a certain perspective, as opposed to feeding knowledge into or letting the machine produce knowledge, this kind of nicely separated things. So I think we might have been producing knowledge with all kinds of things, with all kinds of encounters with matter.
From the first stone we picked up, we produced, and that's the whole argument, right? It's a continuous objectivation. What AI does, it makes this very acute, right, because it exacerbates the idea that the object itself is thinking.
Yeah.
And that's why this misnomer, in fact, helps us think about how poorly named this. Of course, there's the book of Jean-Paul Varnier, which was unfortunately not translated in English, constructing the material culture, the human who thought with his fingers.
Mm-hmm.
So he talks about that in the book, the doing as a thinking. Right. Yeah. And because we mentioned the first stone and the first hammer, I think that, is that saying, and I can say it's true, if you give a kid a 4-year-old, 5-year-old a hammer, everything is a nail. This is us with artificial intelligence. Everything has to be optimized. We are 4 years old with a big optimizing hammer in our hand. and that's a problem.
It has become a fetish, an overloaded sort of fetish. At the same time, you don't seem to be worried about it the same way. For example, you've talked now about augmented anthropology as a way to bring conventional ways of doing anthropology in conversation with, or in some sort of a productive mixture with, machine anthropology. Mm-hmm. Do you want to say a few more things about that?
I'm not worried because I am an optimist, and people say, the pessimists say, okay, we cannot go worse than this, and the optimist says, but yes, we can, it can be worse. But in accepting this as a relationship would allow us to see the limits of, If we do not, if we do not accept the thinking, human and technology together, then we are very prone to project unlimited or infinite power of thinking to the technology.
Yeah.
And that's probably the problem. Even when we talk about the workforce, is that, okay, those systems are very good and doing very specialized work. Very good at it. Do we try to compete with them?
Yeah.
I think that's the wrong path.
Yeah.
Do we try to build the ultimate question is, what kind of societies do we want to build? Do we want to build a society is not that the AI will take over, is that we will build a society that will be very easy for AI to take over.
Right.
Or if we build it on these principles.
Which highlights even further the importance of imagination, of thought, of engagement with the contradictions of these things. Alec, we regrettably are already out of time. So I want to urge our audience to look out for your forthcoming book. And I want to thank you again for engaging with us so generatively on this episode.
Thank you, George.